I remember you mentioned like the omnichannel thing, but for influencers. And you also mentioned like I think more brands should kind of use influencers in, different kind of marketing channels and not just the traditional influence marketing campaigns. So I thought we could maybe start there. Like, tell me just what you mean with omnichannel. Like, yeah, explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about, omnichannel marketing strategies, I think it's largely about, kind of consistency and, kind of complementary content across channels. Like your content really having a thread and working together. So if you're, doing a large brand campaign, maybe you have, your social campaign is very complementary to even your out of home or, your programmatic, whatever it may be, but just really making sure that the experience a customer would have if they see multiple touch points is going to feel like one cohesive brand to them. If they walk by it when they're going to the subway and they see a big billboard and then they like pop on their like Facebook or social media and they get that like same kind of brand campaign that they really do, they're taking something away, and it's kind of that like continued information for them that's kind of starting to pull them through the funnel. That's really what I think of omni-channel. And yeah, I think there's so much opportunity to infuse influencer at a deeper level there.
Cool. So, but then what would you say are the benefits of it? Like if you see that campaign like 7 times, but in different areas, or if wherever you are, what are the benefits, would you say? Or maybe you've seen stuff that work very well.
Yeah. I think it's really like, how we build a habit, like you have to keep doing something kind of time and time again. I think it's very similar in marketing. Like a lot of times we're no longer just sliding down the funnel. It's not like, hey, like you see it and all of a sudden you're going to buy it. Like we're not just sliding down this like perfect funnel. Like our customer journeys are not linear in any way. So the more that we can see relevant content and continue to kind of build on our awareness, kind of continue to maybe even get FOMO because it's like, oh, this looks great. Like I have to keep learning more. Like I want to get involved in this or I want this product. It's just really about kind of building on that like education, building on that, kind of interest, answering more and more questions, I think, for the customer. So if they're, still in that kind of consideration phase, but, they see a new ad, like you're just really building on to that kind of brand story for them. And I think that's
Mm.
where omnichannel could be super helpful versus if you're doing, just regular brand work and they keep getting very different experiences with the brand. Some maybe even conflicting if you're really just not working together at all as a marketing team. I think that can sometimes confuse people or maybe even take them, steps back because they're like, wait, I had this impression of the brand. And now I'm seeing
Mhm.
something completely different on another channel. So just really having that consistency, I think, helps someone make their decision in a better and hopefully quicker way and doesn't kind of throw them off with something completely different.
Yeah. But I can see the conflict, like you said, like you have the performance team, they do something, and then you have the influence team, you have social team, you have I guess outdoor, like the ones that are doing the rest of the
Yeah.
marketing. I mean, you've worked in different organizations. What would you say is a good setup? Like, how should they work together? Like, yeah, do you have any insights on that? Like, if you're a CEO, like, how should you kind of navigate through that so you make sure that everybody works kind of towards the same vision goal when it comes to the marketing channels?
Yeah, I mean, collaboration is key. I think that, I mean, there's so much conversation now that's kind of like, you know, paid and performance versus brand, whereas those things need to be in lockstep with each other. You can't be successful if you're just kind of like working in your own silo, going after your own kind of goals and all of that. Like, if you come together in the very beginning to talk about, let's say, a new brand campaign or the big holiday campaign of the year, if all of you are talking at like the very first step one foundation, you can make sure that both of your goals are being met as you kind of build together. I think a lot of the problem comes in where one team is building something and then another team comes in to kind of like support, but they're really just kind of checking off like a support bucket. They're not necessarily like sold in because it's not necessarily set up to help them like maximize their goals. So everyone, I feel like just teams always need to be in together when it's a campaign. Get in there, ground floor. Let's figure out like what is the build for this campaign? What is our messaging? Like what's our creative umbrella and what are the many ways that this can come to life? And that's really important when it comes to influencer too, because and social, I think that so often influencer, social media are really like those very end of the kind of road conversations. People are like, hey, we have a campaign. How are you going to support this? Whereas if you are the influencer person and you are in there and like that, ground zero, like foundational building, you can be like, hey, we actually have this partner, or the social team could be like, hey, we have this customer who's always talking about us and loves us. Could we leverage them? Like, what is something we can do? Like, you can do influencer videos until, the sun goes down. Like, you could be doing those forever. But could you utilize that influencer in out of home? Could you utilize that influencer in a banner ad because they have like visibility, or just because, quite frankly, they're a customer, you know, and people want like
Mm.
that customer face on a lot of things. So if you think about it that way, it's just thinking about like how do you kind of potentially infuse them throughout an entire process. But to do that, you can't come in at the final stages and be like, hey, I've got this great partner, let's figure out all the best ways to use them, because everyone's already decided. Their creative requests are probably already
Yeah.
in by the time some teams are coming to the table.
But why do you think so few brands? I don't see too many omnichannel strategies around there when it comes to influence marketing. Why do you think still few brands are actually leveraging that and not doing it?
I think it's because, I mean, even in influencer marketing on its own, that brands are in so many different places, so many different like levels of understanding. So you still have people that are kind of functioning in like, I would say like a decade old way, to be honest. Like they're still thinking of influencer in like such an old way. Like they haven't like started to think about, oh, like influencer can be a part of this. They just literally like they have followers, it's for reach, like they put it and they kind of compartmentalize it in a little box. Whereas this is like a voice that likes your brand, it's third party validation, it's quality content. Like those are the things that you have to think about, not just like, here's a human with potential influence who can plug in and help us. So I do think it's just brands are in such different places in terms of like understanding the value and just like the depth that you can get out of it. I think that's so important too. And it comes down to just like being creative, truly understanding influencers. So, that's a big part of it. I think also just, again, like having different teams. I think sometimes there's competing goals. So, you may have a brand team that's like all in on influencers. And then you may have a performance team that's like, well, that seems expensive, or we already know exactly what works. So, like, we don't necessarily need to like try new things, or even the opposite, to be honest. Some brands use influencers just for performance. So they might be all in on influencers, but then maybe the other side's like, this, we don't necessarily know that we need this. So it's just we're in such an interesting place, I feel like, in influencer marketing, where everyone's still like evolving. Different teams have different feelings, also conflicting goals, like I was just saying. Like there are definitely companies who are building themselves on the backs of really great influencer work, which is incredible. um but yeah, it's just like, let's figure out how we can use them all together. And it doesn't have to be the
Mm.
same person. Like one influencer isn't necessarily going to be your best performance and best like conversion driver, as well as your best awareness driver. You have to pick
Yeah.
your right partners for the goals you want to achieve.
Yeah, and yeah, like you said also earlier, like I think there's like different type of brands out there. Some are still stuck in the early days of influencer marketing and kind of running it, but just doing it because they have to, but they don't care
Yeah.
about it really. And then you have the ones that are really pushing the limits and testing new stuff, and I guess also trying these type of new things. I think the ones that just started with UGC very early, or just trying like, let's take this piece and run it give it to the
Mhm.
performance team. I think the ones that started with that early, those are the ones that kind of testing always new stuff. But would
Yeah.
you say there's any like downsides with pushing, I guess, the same creator or same type of campaign in like 6 different marketing channels? So you feel like you get bombarded. Yeah, are there any risks or downside, would you say? Or yeah, what's your thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
I mean, I think the challenge is if you're going to use a creator, you still have to be very cognizant of creating for the space that you're going to use them. So I think one of the biggest challenges and maybe risks is if you have a team that's like, okay, cool, let's do this whole creator omnichannel thing, we're in. And they're like, get a video from them. And they think like one video is going to work somehow. And like, a banner ad and like out of home, they're like, we'll just take a screenshot or something. And they're just not thinking about the fact that like you have this person that does, again, more than just like a video potentially. You have to truly think about how can they show up in different channels. And I don't think it needs to be just one creator. Maybe for some brands they might pick someone who's like a core ambassador for them, but ultimately I feel like when we're working with people in general, regardless of if it's like a model for your campaign, having your customers in your campaign, they should reflect your audience. So you need to have diversity, so that the people
Mm,
who you're trying to appeal to and target as potential customers, they see themselves within the people that are kind of talking to them and kind of carrying your brand message. So you have that ability
mm,
to utilize maybe a small team of creators or whatever works for your campaign, and think about how to plug them in different places. But yeah, I think ultimately the biggest thing there is what I was saying earlier is like it has to be built for the channel. Like you have to give people what they want in the places that they want it, so that the experience you're giving them is the type of experience they're used to having in that kind of scenario. So it's not just like, oh, this is like weird or this is different, like, move by it or don't pay attention to it.
yeah. But yeah, that's great. But then when it comes to the practical stuff, if I would then think of like, let's start this omni-channel strategy, how would my approach be when I'm looking for creators and thinking like, okay, creator A, let's do a podcast with her. Creator B, TV commercial. Like, how should you think? How should you evaluate creators? Do you have any ideas there? Like, if you would just start that strategy now, how should you think when you kind of setting everything up?
Yeah. I think for, especially for omnichannel, really for any campaign, I think there's this thing I like to say is like your customer with influence. So it's not just about finding the right influencers, but it's about finding people who might already be your customers. And I think a lot of times people don't think of influencers that way. It's like, this is just an influencer. And again, they're kind of compartmentalizing them, but they're real humans and they use real products, and they might already love your brand, or it might be in their daily rotation or their cell phone service, whatever the brand is. So if you can find those influencers who are already your customers, again, flipping it to almost being like, these are our customers, they just happen to have influence for a living. If you can kind of first like identify, and honestly, you shouldn't just be identifying them for the first time. Like your social team, your influencer team should literally have a running list of like people who love the brand, who, are like your, are potentially influential as well. So if you kind of already have that built, or if you are building that, you can kind of really think about like, what are the strengths of these different people? And I think that's really important. So let's say everyone's like, we're building an omni-channel holiday campaign. That would be the first thing that I had like a influencer and social team do, is put together that list of your most influential customers, or your influencers who are already customers, who have talked about us, who've tagged us, maybe who we've worked with and we know it really resonates with them, so they've become big brand fans. And then figure out, what are their strengths. Do you have a
Mm,
podcaster in there? Do you have someone who's great at like YouTube and long form video? And then you can kind of look to see like, what are the potential holes that we don't have, and start maybe identifying some additional people to be a part of the mix. But I think that is kind of a great way to get started. And then obviously thinking about all the other campaign things that are be going on, and what the creative team might plug in, and really start to think about how you can work together, and just where those kind of opportunities are to to expand influencer work and the voices that you're going to use.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, I think just going to the basics, I think many brands forget that. Just go to your
Mm-hmm.
customers. Yeah, I mean, if you have thousands of customers, maybe a few of them at least have some kind of influence. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's great.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have any
Great.
examples?
Oh, let's see. Well, for us, I mean, so for my company, we utilize influencers who have user stories. So they have to have like an actual story of our brand because we're not just something that you can kind of convince people of, not everyone needs us in the moment. We're a prescription savings company. So if you have a prescription that is expensive, that you can't afford, or that your insurance isn't covering, that's when, kind of we are super relevant for that person. So we do utilize user stories because we want to make sure it's super authentic and it's not just any influencer saying like, go try this brand, it's great, even though they haven't used it. So we have a ton of influencers who are actual customers. And again, I think that's where a lot of brands don't necessarily like think about it because they're like they're influencers, but you're like a brand that people might be using every day. Like what is their shampoo they're using? It's just about doing the extra work to identify it. And I do think it definitely takes extra work to find people who are already your customers because it's not just like reaching out and saying, do you want to work for, kind of this brand or do you want to work for this? It's reaching out to say, are you utilizing this product already? And kind of finding the right people. And that's how you start to build your stable of influencers who are real life customers already. We have some really large kind of influencers and creators that we get to work with, and that we're really lucky that they're customers and that they're open to telling their story. So I think it's the extra work to find those people and not just kind of land on this is a cool creator. Let's work with them to tell our story. You're definitely going to be spending more time finding folks who are super loyal to you as a brand. But I think it's well worth it because the storytelling is going to be so much better than if you just hand them a content brief and they haven't experienced the product before.
Yeah. But you said like if they mention you on Instagram, I guess that's a one indication of that maybe kind of like your product already. But do you have any tips and tricks on how to find the influencers that maybe already bought your product, like hacks?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's all about like understanding who obviously your regular customers are and then thinking about how might that person show up in social. So for us, we, again, having like this prescription tie, we'll go and look for people who might talk about like specific conditions. Like they may have never ever mentioned us, and honestly, most of them haven't. I would say 90% plus of the people that we've gone out and kind of found use us have never mentioned us before. So we found them because they've talked about conditions before. So we know that if someone has X condition, there's a possibility that they, potentially are taking prescriptions for it and the possibility that maybe they've used us. So it's definitely, again, like that additional legwork. I think similarly, if you are, let's say a fashion brand and you're looking at, creator styles, or you can start to look at like keywords and kind of see like what other brands are they talking about. Maybe they have worked with your competitor that has like a very similar style, so they're tagging them all the time, but maybe they're wearing you like all the time, you're just not like their partner. So it's it's almost like this reverse engineer of like what are the keywords or the behaviors of people that we know like use us or would use us, and then just outreach and start to get to know people and build
Mm.
relationships. And sometimes it's also finding accounts that you're like, man, this could be a really cool story, or this is a really like interesting account that's doing something different. And sometimes it's just outreach and you'd be like, hey, are you familiar with the product? Is this something you use? Maybe it's not. But in that case, it's something where maybe they're not a fit for like a user story or something where they're already a customer. But why not then potentially send them the product, have them get to know the product, give them some time with it. They might be a customer all of a sudden in a few months, and you've started to build that relationship, and then you can potentially leverage them in the future. So I think it's just kind of thinking a little bit deeper than let me just go find an influencer and plug them into things. It's like it's either finding your customers within the influencer subset, starting to build customers and build familiarity with your product with some of these like influencers who really make sense for the brand, and just like putting a little bit of extra time into it.
I like that. Yeah. Like if they're not using your product, just give them free products and see if they like it. And not even expecting them to post nothing, just hear their feedback. If they love it, obviously they will just reach back and love it and probably buy more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. But you said user stories. What is that and how do you leverage that to get sales?
So for us, for user stories, it's ultimately just someone's story. So when they're talking about like our service, it's their true and genuine story. So that's people who have already had experiences with the brand and they're just infusing it into their content. And we just call it user stories because it's kind of like their, it's kind of a testimonial in some ways, people will call them, especially if they're, not influencers. We also have user story series that are highly produced where we're speaking with people who don't even have, social media and definitely aren't, influencers. So it's just kind of another layer of user story. And again, I think that makes the influencer content even more powerful. It's just their story. Like they've used your product, they love your product. Here's how it like works in their everyday life. Maybe here's what they used to use, why they switched. There's just so much more depth. So we just call it a user story because it is just this genuine thing. It's not something that necessarily is like following a content brief. It's their experience.
Mm. But and what do you do with that? And like, what's yeah? You get the user story. Like, do you? Yeah, tell me about the process there.
Yeah, I mean, anytime that we work with creators, if they're just doing like a regular story, it's just like regular content. So it's on their channels.
Mm.
We're, supporting it with paid. We're considering it for other, marketing channels that might make sense. So it just really kind of depends on the person, but it's treated exactly like regular content. And honestly, it is. Like, if you really think about it, any influencer who is talking about a brand that has been a part of their life for a long time, like that really is a quote unquote user story, because that's their real story. That's something, they've used the brand, they love it. Maybe they tell you a little like story about when it was, infused in their life, or if it was, let's say, food, like maybe in a recipe that their mom used to make as a kid or something. Like that's truly like their user story. Like it's not just a promotion. And I think those are very
Yeah.
different. Like a user story is something that can absolutely sell a product for you, but it can sell the product for you and it can get people excited about it because of how authentic that storytelling is and because of like how ingrained it is in that influencer's life, versus just like, this is a great product that I am, telling you about and I think you should go
Yeah.
buy. It's just like levels deeper.
Yeah, it feels more real than just a regular ad,
Mhm.
I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is so that user story telling the problem and the whole thing and why they then bought you and how kind of your product solve everything. Would you say that is really working right now within the space? Is that the number one thing to do or yeah?
I think I think it depends on the brand. Like what do you need or what do your potential customers need to hear from you to kind of move them through the journey? Do they need to hear from other people, how it works in their life, like how it's made their life better? Like do they need a little more of that like depth? I think for some brands, yes, like maybe if it's a brand that has like a higher investment, maybe it's more expensive, or maybe if it's a brand who has a lot of competition, so you're trying to like stand out from the competition, people might need a little bit more depth there. If it's a fashion brand, like do you necessarily need like a user story, or maybe even a food brand, like do you always need like this in-depth story, or do you potentially you just need to see how it looks and you need to feel like this may look good on you as well? Or if it's food, like do you just
Mm.
need like a killer recipe that's super approachable that you feel like you could make too? So it's honestly, it's about understanding your brand, understanding the customers you're trying to reach and what's going to help them kind of get through the funnel and help them make the decision to try your brand.
Yeah, I guess if you're a fashion brand selling like a dress, maybe you don't need a like a super deep story. It's more like you
Yeah.
said, like how it looks, how it feels wearing it, I guess, and things like that. Um, but if we look, I mean, you know tons about this industry. So if we look future now, what do you think? Any trends that you see popping up, like any social media platforms that is coming up? Like, yeah, what's the future? Would you say? Anything you've seen?
Yeah, I think, I mean, honestly, some of this omnichannel stuff is a big part of the future because I just, like you said earlier, I don't think brands are doing it. So I think just utilizing influencers in smarter ways, as broad as that is, I think that that is a huge part of like what people are working towards. And just doing influencer marketing better. I think we're in this space where, like I said earlier, people are kind of at so many different places. So some people are doing amazing campaigns that have a lot of depth to them, maybe have ambassadors and events and all of these different components, whereas you might still have people who are choosing influencers based on the size of their following and have no idea that that influencer is actually bought their following, first of all, or are using like engagement pods and have no real followers at all. So I just think that this industry needs to like tighten up a bit in terms of like quality and like how we're kind of seeing work come to life. So I feel like that's a huge thing, really. This omnichannel, bringing influencer teams out of a silo. I always like to say, like, they're so siloed, typically so kind of final thought. So more teams breaking out of silos and really thinking about how to make this a part of much bigger kind of campaigns. I think utilizing influencers just in smarter ways, like getting creative, knowing that it doesn't have to just be this like perfect photo or perfect video, like truly enjoying like a mix of partners. So like you said earlier, like maybe you have a podcaster, maybe you've got like a
Mm.
YouTuber, you've got someone that does just TikTok, like really leveraging voices that work for your brand and stories and diversity of creation and absolutely diversity of people, because again, like, we can't treat influencers like this group who they shouldn't always look the same. Bottom line, like, you have to
Yeah.
pick influencers who are representative of your customers, who are representative of their voices so that they see themselves in these people. So making sure that you truly are representing that is so important. So I think this industry is so exciting because it changes so fast, but everyone's changing at different speeds. So I think we're just going to continue to kind of evolve and people are going to catch up. And I think it's exciting. But yeah.
Yeah. But something I forgot to ask you just as a final thing. Um, if you do this omnichannel, I think most brands kind of know like a short this one we run it through TikTok and then we know the compensation model on that. Instagram is a different compensation. But if you would do like I don't know outdoor ad or like banner like you said or a TV commercial, how does the compensation look like for the creator? Like I mean, with UGC, I want to run it through Meta. You pay extra fee. But how does it look if you're gonna do those kind of marketing channels? Do you have any insights on that or experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you think about the other, things that you've paid for in that realm. So let's say you've worked with models for photo shoots, to do the billboards. You kind of think about like what the costs typically are in that arena, and then you kind of think about like, okay, like how does that relate for an influencer? Just like how people are utilizing creators to create like UGC style content. They're not paying them as if they were posting it on their channel. They're kind of paying as if they were photographers ultimately. So really relating it to, if I paid for this in another way, or if I paid someone else to do this, like how do we normally do that? Because ultimately it's a partnership, because a lot of these influencers and creators also might not have done an out of home ad before, or maybe they haven't like
Mm.
created something that's going to become a mobile ad or a banner ad. So they may also be like, well, I don't know how to charge for this. Like I normally am posting on my feed. So you
Yeah.
do really need to come with like an understanding of like, as the marketers, like we have to own the understanding of here's how much things cost when we're utilizing them in different spaces, and then be able to kind of have those like conversations with creators. Broadly across everything, I always tell people like pricing is such a crazy place right now. It's all over. It's literally, it's, if your imagination, it's all over. Um, so I tell all marketers, like when you are negotiating, you absolutely have to understand values. You have to have internal pricing models, whatever you're going to utilize. Like you need to feel confident so that when you are going to have a conversation with an influencer, you are coming to the table with how much you like think this whole like deliverable set that you're asking for, this whole relationship is worth. And you need to make sure obviously it's fair, but you also need to make sure that it's not over the moon and is then going to affect your ROI because you paid 3 times
Yeah.
what that person is kind of bringing to the table. So that's something that marketers have to understand because we're the ones that are tied into metrics. We own the budgets. Ultimately, like the end kind of product of what happens of an influencer campaign sits on our lap. So you don't ever want to just go to someone and say, how much money do you want for this? I mean, you know, 10 times. Like, of course, like if someone said, how much money do you want to like work here without, someone negotiating, I would say twice my salary. Like it's not
Yeah.
wild to think someone how much they want. They're going to give you something that's like very large because wouldn't we all like to get rich quick? So,
Yeah.
there has to be understanding as that person who controls the budget of what is this value.
It's funny because I asked actually on the other side, so the talent manager, like, so how do you price your creators? Like, how do you charge? And they're like, yeah, it depends on who's asking. Sometimes I just set a price, and they're quite honest. And then I'm like, okay, now I understand why it's so important. Like you said, have kind of your own metrics inside, so you know what's worth for us. So it really makes sense for for the company. But
Yeah.
then I'm asking you then. So what type of metrics do you use internally? Is it CPM or yeah? What's your favorite metrics that you usually use to kind of compare creators and obviously evaluate if it's worth it?
Yeah. So for us, we usually use like it's called different things, but like CPV, a lot of people call it like a CPI, like cost per impression. Those can be kind of used
Mm,
together. So most of what we do is video. So we're thinking about like kind of that metric. But we have like a very specific kind of like modeling. It's not just like one formula and we plug everything into it. We have like several formulas and we'll kind of take like the strength of the creator, like their kind of creation strength, their community strength, which is mission critical, and I don't think a lot of people are still thinking about it. Like if their comment sections are crickets and there's nothing happening in there and they haven't actually built a loyal community, like you really have to think about like, does that person have influence? Like it goes back to like follower count does not equal influence. um so yeah, so looking at like we kind of have 3 tiers and kind of put them into like which tier they're in. We then kind of go through kind of the formulas and then kind of look to say like, okay, based on like usage and other things, like what are do we need to go up from this, do we potentially need to go down from this? But it's there's kind of this whole like methodology, but we're taking everything into consideration and then we're plugging in and we have this final rate that we're kind of willing to offer this person, always
yeah,
with like a little bit of room obviously for conversation. But I think that's how you have to really think about things. And then you can also obviously use all of your internal data in terms of what you've seen in the past, like a creator very similar, like did this make sense for them? And then you're only going to get better the more you're kind of doing it and more comfortable, obviously. But it's so important. I mean, we've had people who come to us and they ask for literally 5 to 6 times. And it's like, well, no, like here's the amount that we were willing to offer. And they're like, oh, okay. And I have to be like super frank. Like this obviously usually happens with like talent managers, which rings very true for like what you just said, that numbers are can sometimes just be created. And I think there's a lot of misconception. Sometimes I think they're like, oh, it's a big brand. Let me ask them for a ton of money because they're a big brand and they're rich. Well, ultimately it goes back to like understanding how like budgets work and how marketing works. And just because they're a huge brand doesn't mean their influencer team has a huge budget. Like they're given a budget at the beginning of their fiscal year, and that's what they have to spend on campaigns per month, whatever the case is. Um, it's not just like, wow, they're a rich brand, they can pay unlimited dollars. They may have a small budget because maybe the company still isn't sure that investing in influencers makes sense. Or maybe they're so successful, they're like, we only use influencers a little bit to kind of keep it fresh and stay up with things. So
Mm.
you really can't price your influencer based on, we think this brand might have money. Like you have to price them based on their value. And ultimately, there are a lot of, I think, agents that don't really consider how much they're actually hurting their clients by overpricing them. Because if you tell a brand someone is worth way more than they are, chances are that brand will never consider them again. And other brands might find out the same thing. And all of a sudden, your creators' businesses are hurt because people won't work with them because they are now known as being overpriced. And they might not even know what their agent is pitching for them. So it's affecting their business
Yeah.
long term and they don't even know, which I think happens more often than I think we know or, kind of think about. But all of that stuff's important. And there's some agencies that, brand people won't work with because they always overprice. So it's just not even worth a conversation at some points. And that really also hurts, obviously, their clients. So being realistic and being fair has to come from all sides. And I understand everyone wants to make money and get the most out of this industry, but it just can't be about being unfair and overpricing. There has to be like a fairness level to it and like this is their
Yeah.
value. This is why we're charging this.
Yeah. And also thinking more like long term. And I would say the idea of like, oh, you're a big company, you're profitable, you probably have a lot of cash to give me. I would say, just based on my experience of just selling other services, the ones with great numbers, great revenue, cash flow, they really think of, where they put their money. So I think some of
Yeah.
those type of companies are even more cautious, like, and really looking at the numbers and not just investing from nowhere compared to like the classic, I don't know, startup that is back with like, I don't know, 10, 100 millions. They will just throw money because it's just testing out. So yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes um, the big companies are maybe the cheap ones.
Yeah. Yeah. You never know. So yeah, that's why it's like, don't price based on that kind of stuff. Like, what is this person's value? Um, and you should be telling the same, like different brands in different spaces, like the same thing because you truly feel confident in what someone's like value is. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's a lot of growth to happen.
But nice. Yeah, yeah. But great, Nicole. This was great. Thanks for, I mean, being on the show and sharing all the insights. And yeah, it was great.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is, yeah, I love these conversations. I appreciate being here.